Today, we're joining in with the Love Your Railway campaign. And if you don't know what that is, it's a social media thing that has been spearheaded by the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, designed to help raise the profile of railways all over the UK's social media presences, and also to let you guys know that they exist, and so you can come visit and help them to get them back and going after the big global pandemic thing. The history of the original Mid-Suffolk Light Railway is an interesting one, because it's a railway that really never should have happened, and certainly it shouldn't have survived as long as it did. At the turn of the century, in 1900, construction started. The idea was that the railway would link the town of Hawley on the London to Norwich main line with Halesworth, which was the start of the well-known Southwold Railway. Until that point, the heart of Suffolk was relatively unbreached. It was a rural, simple farming area. People didn't really leave the area. You'd grow up in the village, you'd marry someone from the village, and you'd die in the village. Perhaps you'd work on the farm, or you'd get a job doing something else to do with the farm. Life wasn't very varied back then, and people couldn't really travel. Suffolk was, well, nothing. It was farming, and goods didn't really go anywhere because there was nowhere to get it. You had to get to either side of the county to transport anything. So on paper at least, the railway made sense. To go through all this farm area, collect the traffic, bring money into the area, and take goods and produce from the fertile Suffolk soil elsewhere. It was perfect. It made so much sense. And the idea was, at Kenton, a station almost in the middle, a line would drop down, winding its way further down through Suffolk until it would get to Westerfield, which is the junction for the East Suffolk line branching off for Felixstowe. Surely this made total sense. And yes, many people thought it did. Many people invested. As the railway expanded, built under the Light Railway Act, which meant that track be laid to a lighter standard, being dog spiked in place and have less complicated signalling, all in the trade-off of having a greatly reduced line speed of 25 miles an hour. And the line went off that way, making its way through the countryside, stopping and building stations, some of which were closer to the previous village than the village they were actually named after. And by 1904, there was a problem. You see, the survey that had been done wasn't particularly good. So they got as far as Laxfield and went, ooh, it's a bit boggy around here, isn't it? You can't really go that way because we're going to have to spend an awful lot of money to put enough ground in and reinforce the bog and chuck stuff in so it doesn't sink. Maybe we could go another route. So that was proposed. And they went, actually, no, we can't do that either. So a third idea was eventually drafted that involved building a bridge and going over the top of the main line in Halesworth and coming in the same size of the Southwold Railway. These were all wonderful ideas, but in order to make any of them happen and to continue the railway past Cratfield Mills, they needed money. So the wonderful idea was, let us open the railway, and then all of the income from people using our railway will help finish the railway. Sounds brilliant on paper, doesn't it? The Board of Trade arrived to inspect the railway to say, yes, it's fit for traffic. And they said, no. Yep, it was not fit for passenger use. It was allowed for freight. The engine delivered to work the trains at Hudswell Clark and 060, that was delivered chained to the rails. They wouldn't be released until they'd had their first payment because the company was so worried that the Mid-Suffolk would actually be able to pay them. And it took a further 4 years for the standard of the railway that was existing to be upgraded enough for the Board of Trade to approve passenger running to Laxfield. It was so bad that the chairman was buying jewellery on credit and pawning it the same day just to get cash to try and get the business working, because he believed so much that if they could just make it happen, the railway would work. The extension that came from Kenton down towards Debenham was started and soon abandoned. And that's basically as far as the railway ever got. It never got beyond Cratfield Mills, and that was never for passengers. The passenger service ended at Laxfield, and that was it. The Mid-Suffolk Light Railway ran out of Hawley, up a very steep bank, through the loco shed, and along through Suffolk to nowhere. It really was the railway to nowhere. And from that, well, nothing really changed. There were 3 locomotives. 1 and 3 were pretty much the same. 2 was mostly the same, a bit smaller, and he thought started life as a 240 for another order before being repurposed to come at the Mid-Suffolk. The red that's used on the liveries, that was Huswell Clark Primer. They never got any more grand than that. The stock was all second-hand, ex-Great Eastern old stock. The railway never really made any money, and by the time the grouping happened in 1923, the MSLR's finances were a mess. So bad, in fact, that the LNER refused to take the railway under its wing, not wanting to take on the debts. And it struggled on for another year, one of only 3 railways which survived until 1924 outside of the grouping, until, because it was an Act of Parliament, the government had said LNER, LMS, Great Western and Southern would form, that the LNER were taken to court and forced to take the Mid-Suffolk. And they only did so on the condition that the debts would be abolished. And when they did, they took one look at the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway's tank engines and immediately scrapped number 3. Numbers 1 and 2 survived as carriage shunters in Ipswich and Stratford works respectively. Number 1 was quite unusual in although it received the LNER on its tanks, it remained red. The LNER chose to replace the old tank engines with the J65 Blackwall tanks, which became the mainstay of the Mid-Suffolk for most of its history. There are some wonderful stories though. For instance, early in the LNER days, an inspector came up from Ipswich to inspect the newly acquired railway and to see how they did things. And he was shocked, because if you had a particularly big train, the tank engines weren't that big or strong. So what they would do is put a massive fire in it, bring the pressure up to almost blowing off, and then just go for it. Full open regulator and storm up the bank. And if they didn't make it, they'd reverse up to the buffer stops, push and compress every single set of buffers, build the fire up again to almost blowing off, and then go for it a second time, this time using the springs of the buffers as a kind of slingshot effect to give them a bit more oomph. The inspector was not impressed, and he said, "That is not the way that you drive a locomotive." So the driver went, "Sure, show me." On the 3rd attempt of failing to get up the bank, driving a locomotive properly, the inspector left, never to be seen at the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway again. The railway shouldn't have survived, and the LNER wanted rid of this railway. And then the war happened. And the railway became quite useful because it served several air bases, notably that at Mendlesham and Horham, which meant that the LNER had to upgrade it. They took it all from the flat-bottom dog-spike rail up to the standard round-bottom stuff sat in chairs that we use today. There is a wonderful story from the war of a passenger getting off his train at Hawley looking to travel along the Mid-Suffolk. And by the time he'd worked out which platform it was, he was in time to see the train driving away up the bank. A porter saw him and said, "Did you mean to catch that train, sir?" To which the reply was, "Yes, but don't worry, I'll wait for the next one." At that point, the porter brought out a flag, waving frantically at the train, which stopped, reversed back down the hill. The gentleman was thrust inside the train, whereas it then stomped up the bank a second time. He was informed that, although it was Friday evening, the next train was actually Monday morning, so he would have had a rather long wait at Hawley. After the war, the LNER was now looking for a reason to get rid of it, but they didn't manage to because British Railways was formed in 1948, and they took one look at this line and went, no. And it survived just 4 years before they closed it in 1952. But during that time, they installed the J15s to work the line, which have become synonymous with the image of the Mid-Suffolk, the little tender engines working their way through. And there are wonderful stories with that as well. There's a story of one of the tubes going inside the boiler and being halfway up the line with nowhere to pass. it would have been hours before a rescue locomotive could come along. So they took their brake stick and a hammer, cut it in twain, hammered it into the offending tube at both ends, and then limped on with the injectors running to get it back, at least to Kenton, where another train could pass. Originally, on every crossing, they were gated and had a crossing keeper who would open the gates for the trains and then shut them after they'd been through. When the LNER came along, they very quickly got rid of the crossing keepers and made the crews do it. The crew would stop, the firemen get off, open the gate, and the guard would shut it after the train was through. This worked very well, apart from occasionally the drivers forgot and just went trundling straight through the gates. And so there was a plan. If a gate was destroyed, rather than replace it, you'd have a piece of string with a red flag. And on one day, a driver went through on his way up, demolishing the gate, and on the way down, he came back and demolished the piece of string. In the very early days of the railway, the engine known as number 2 had a hole in the roof because they used to take a shotgun and shoot pheasants and rabbits from the footplate to take them home for dinner. And one day the shotgun had been put down and gone off, blasting a hole in the roof that was never repaired. When the railway closed in 1952, there was a lot of song and dance about it. There was a last train, and the railway carried more passengers than it had ever done in a day before. And that should have been the end of the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway. A Ruston 48 was sent up the line to collect it, load it up and bring it back piece by piece. One section of the line, they'd already tarmacked over the level crossing, so the train was pushed through the fresh tarmac, gouging a path to be able to access further down the line. And after that, after it was all picked up and everything of value taken away, I mean, the buildings they're tin sheds. They took nothing to remove. And the fact that they're still here is miraculous because, well, they're flat pack. They're taken down and thrown away. But after they went, there was nothing left save one coach of the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway. The society started in 1990. It was members of the Stowmarket Model Railway Club came together with the idea of making a museum to the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway. The idea that this little railway shouldn't be forgotten and how important it had once been to the area, becoming this lifeline, this way out, this way that the outside world could reach and the way the local community could reach the outside world. And that if nothing happened within a few short generations, all trace and all memories of this line would be lost forever. So the idea was to talk to the Museum of East Anglian Life to see if they'd like to have a small museum with artefacts, maybe one of the station buildings that had become available. And they said no. And undeterred, the guys decided they would look for a site to have a museum to the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway. And several of the surviving stations, the banks themselves, were still here. There is this one here at Brockford, and the next station up, Aspel, still survives as well. And admittedly, maybe a slightly better site. But this one is just off the A140, meaning it's good for people to come and visit. It's easy to come off the main road, it's easy to find. And so they started at Brockford with absolutely nothing. There are lots of heritage railways which have been brought back from nothing. But it was written that nowhere else in the country did a railway disappear so well as the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway. No other railway returned to farmland without a trace as Mid-Suffolk. There was nothing here. Everything you see on site has been done via the work of volunteers. People giving their time, their effort and money to be able to put this railway back. This here is what's left of the cattle dock. The original station, that's underneath the industrial units just at the end of our yard. And this was extended to be the same length as the original midi platforms. In fact, on some days, stood over there, you can even see the difference between the original bricks and the new extension that's been put on it. And originally, in its first incarnation, the idea was just to have a museum to the Mid-Suffolk. The station, maybe an item or two of rolling stock in the platform. And slowly, that idea evolved. It became bigger. A locomotive was bought. Hudswell Clark number 1604, Mid-Suffolk number 4. And that engine was placed at the end of the platform to demonstrate a locomotive of similar size and proportions to what once worked here. A coach and a brake van, wagons turned up, and slowly it evolved that with the stock that we had, we needed a diesel shunter, which is where the Ruston 165 was bought to move things around. And from there, the idea snowballed further. The short bit of track turned into a short demonstration line with sidings, which then turned into a short run. And from that, the idea snowballed until in 2002, to celebrate the anniversary of 50 years since the line closed, the J15 from the Norfolk Railway was brought back in here to operate the first steam trains. And the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway was truly reborn.